compulsory universal KiwiSaver.
Todd McClay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Pleasure to speak on this bill in second reading, and I want to thank members opposite to Mr. Parker for the way that we're able to work constructively together on the committee on this legislation. And whilst for those who are listening, no, that was, I said David Bennett didn't work constructively in the committee. I didn't say Mr. Parker. Anyway, getting back to this important issue, although for those who may be listening or will read about this in the newspaper, it's not the most exciting piece of legislation, it is nonetheless quite important, and it has the ability to have great effect upon banks, those who borrow from banks, and the cost of their borrowing to some degree. See, Mr. Speaker, it sets up a legislative framework for the issuing of covered bonds. Covered bonds, the covered bonds market in the world is worth some $2 trillion every year, which is a very large amount of money. Some would say the amount that New Zealand would come close to owing if we didn't have a national government and if the Labour Party was in charge. Thankfully, that's not the case. But the reason it's so important for us to have this legislation is because banks in New Zealand are already entering into covered bonds borrowing around the world, and they're doing so without the legislative framework to control what the borrowing that they undertake, but also to give legal certainty to rights and responsibilities. I think, from memory, there are 4 banks in New Zealand, we heard in Select Committee, who have borrowed covered bonds, and they've done so through contractual agreement or relationship. And what that means is, in as far as giving preference, should a bank fail, heaven forbid, I don't believe that will be the case with the larger banks in New Zealand, but should one fail, through contract, the companies, the banks that have lent to them covered bonds will already have the ability to have the first chance to get a return on their loans. So all this legislation really is doing is bringing this within the gambit of the law, creating a statute to control it, Mr. Speaker, and in turn giving legal certainty to those that would lend to our banks under the covered bond scheme, and I think brings us into line with almost every other country in the world, including Australia, who put in place this legislation in 2010. Now, I think in the committee of the whole House stage there will be an opportunity to go into some of the detail of the issues that Mr. Parker raised, and I very much look forward to that. But I want to pick him up on the point that he spoke of, one point he spoke of, around the percentage of that banks in New Zealand could borrow in the covered bond scheme that would be covered compared to their assets. And we did agree that it should be set at 10%. Indeed, already the Reserve Bank has ensured that it is 10%. We've decided to put that in legislation. The challenge with looking at a lower rate, as other countries may use, is that the banks in New Zealand, by compared to the assets of many overseas banks, are relatively less significant, and therefore the ability of our banks to be able to borrow from some of the more important covered bond markets in Europe and America and elsewhere would be limited. And I understand that in Europe, as an example, to lend covered bonds, that some of their lenders have limits as to the amount, and our banks would miss out. So, look, Mr. Speaker, I think it's an important piece of legislation. We'll have a chance to talk about it much more. But I just want to say at this stage to the submitters that came before the committee, it was useful for both sides of the House to be able to delve into some of the greater detail of this bill to a greater degree, and I'm grateful to some of the experts that had much more knowledge than we initially did before we started on this process. Thank you.
Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
Mr. Speaker, I think my colleague David Parker provided a good